Have you ever wondered what the most powerful force in human history might be? Some might say it's love, others might point to war, and many would suggest it's money or technology. But there's something else that has sustained humanity through our darkest hours and elevated our greatest triumphs, something that predates our modern innovations by thousands of years. That something is praise. In the ancient world, approximately 3,000 years ago, a king sat down to write what scholars now consider one of the most beautiful compositions of gratitude ever penned. This wasn't just any king, this was David, the shepherd boy who became the ruler of Israel around 1000 BCE. The composition? Psalm 145, the last psalm personally attributed to David in the biblical collection. What makes this particular psalm so remarkable? It is the only psalm in the entire collection explicitly titled a psalm of praise. In Hebrew, it's called Tehillah el David, David's praise. While many psalms contain elements of praise, this one is wholly dedicated to the art and discipline of praising God. And within its verses lies a timeless formula for living a life of gratitude, perspective, and purpose. Jerusalem, 970 BCE. The golden age of Israel's united monarchy is at its peak. The temple hasn't yet been built. That task would fall to David's son Solomon, but the Ark of the Covenant now rests in Jerusalem. David, approaching the end of his tumultuous life, reflects on everything: his humble beginnings, his victories, his failures, his sins, and ultimately, the faithfulness of God through it all. The morning air is crisp as the king takes up his writing instruments. Perhaps he's sitting in the palace gardens, or maybe he's found a quiet corner of his royal quarters. Wherever he is, David begins to write what scholars believe may have been among his final compositions. What emerges is not a lament about the difficulties of life or even a celebratory song about his achievements. Instead, it's a structured, alphabetical acrostic poem, each verse beginning with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet that systematically praises the character and actions of God. But what's particularly fascinating about Psalm 145 is what happened to it over the centuries that followed. By the time of the Second Temple period, 516 BCE to 70 CE, this psalm had become so central to Jewish worship that it was recited 3 times daily by devout Jews. The Talmud, compiled around 500 CE, declares that whoever recites Psalm 145 3 times a day is assured of a place in the world to come. Even today, it forms an integral part of Jewish prayer services, particularly in the morning Shacharit service. So what is it about these 21 verses that has captivated the human spirit for 3 millennia? Let's explore this masterpiece of praise together and discover why its message resonates as powerfully today as it did when David first composed it. I will exalt you, my God the King. I will praise your name forever and ever. Every day I will praise you and extol your name forever and ever. These opening lines establish the entire tone of the psalm. Notice how personal this is. David doesn't begin with theological abstractions, but with a direct, intimate address. My God the King. This is relationship language. In a fascinating historical irony, here we have a king addressing God as king. David, despite his royal status, recognizes a higher authority in his life. The Hebrew word translated as exalt here is aramimka, which carries connotations of lifting something high above everything else. It's a word about priorities and perspective. David is essentially saying, I will put you, God, above everything else in my life. And then there's that powerful phrase, forever and ever. In Hebrew, this is Elolam Vaed, a phrase suggesting both unending time and completeness. David isn't speaking of occasional praise when he feels like it, but of a continuous, eternal commitment. The repetition in verse 2 emphasizes this isn't just poetic hyperbole. David means what he's saying. When we consider that David wrote this likely near the end of his life, these words take on even deeper significance. This is a man who had experienced everything life could throw at him: the exhilaration of defeating Goliath around 1023 BCE, the paranoia of King Saul hunting him through the wilderness for nearly a decade, the tragedy of losing his first child with Bathsheba in approximately 997 BCE, the heartbreak of his son Absalom's rebellion around 980 BCE. Through all of this, David had discovered something. Praise wasn't just a response to good circumstances, but a lifeline through all circumstances. Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise, his greatness no one can fathom. One generation commends your works to another, they tell of your mighty acts. Here David shifts from personal devotion to universal truth. The Hebrew word for great here is gadol, which implies not just size but significance, importance, and power. David is asserting that God's greatness is an objective reality, not just his subjective experience. And then comes one of the most profound lines in the psalm, his greatness no one can fathom. The Hebrew word checker, translated as fathom, means to search out completely or investigate thoroughly. David is acknowledging that God's greatness exceeds human comprehension, an early recognition of what theologians would later call the transcendence of God. Verse 4 introduces a crucial concept: intergenerational testimony. In ancient Near Eastern cultures of the 10th century BCE, oral tradition was the primary means of preserving history and values. Without widespread literacy or publishing technology, knowledge survived through intentional telling and retelling. David envisions a continuous chain of testimony about God's mighty acts, stretching from generation to generation. Archaeological findings from ancient Israel dating to this period, 10th century BCE, reveal a society deeply concerned with preserving narratives of divine intervention from the Exodus from Egypt. Approximately 1446 BCE according to some scholars, or 1290 BCE according to others, to the conquest of Canaan, to David's own rise to power. This wasn't merely religious devotion but identity formation. The stories of God's mighty acts shaped how Israel understood itself as a nation. They speak of the glorious splendor of your majesty, and I will meditate on your wonderful works. They tell of the power of your awesome works, and I will proclaim your great deeds. They celebrate your abundant goodness and joyfully sing of your righteousness. Notice the poetic structure here. There's a pattern of they statements followed by I will responses. David observes what others are doing in praise and commits himself to join this collective chorus. This suggests that praise isn't meant to be merely private but communal. The Hebrew words used here paint a vivid picture. Glorious splendor, hadar kavod, suggests visible magnificence. Wonderful works, divrei niflateka, refers to acts that inspire wonder. Awesome works, izuz norateka, implies deeds that inspire reverent fear. And abundant goodness, Rav Tuvka, conveys overflowing benevolence. When we consider the historical context of David's reign, these weren't empty phrases. By 970 BCE, Israel had transformed from a loose confederation of tribes to a united monarchy with international recognition. The borders were secure, prosperity was increasing, and cultural achievements were flourishing. For many Israelites, this national success was tangible evidence of God's wonderful works and abundant goodness. Yet scholars note that David himself had experienced both the heights of success and the depths of failure. Just a decade earlier, around 980 BCE, his own son Absalom had led a rebellion that temporarily forced David into exile. The king who writes of God's righteousness is the same man who had committed adultery with Bathsheba and arranged for her husband Uriah's death in battle around 997 BCE. David's praise comes not from naivety, but from having experienced both judgment and restoration. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. Here we reach what many scholars consider the theological heart of the psalm. These verses echo the self-revelation of God to Moses in Exodus 34 verses 6 to 7, a formulation so important in Hebrew theology that it appears multiple times throughout the Hebrew scriptures. These attributes, grace, compassion, patience, love, formed the core understanding of God's character in ancient Israel. The Hebrew term chesed, translated here as love, is particularly significant. It refers to covenant faithfulness, a steadfast loyalty that persists even when the covenant partner fails. In the ancient Near East of the 10th century BCE, covenant relationships structured everything from international politics to personal relationships. Treaties between nations, marriage contracts, and commercial agreements all relied on this concept of binding commitment. For David to describe God as rich and chesed meant God was the ultimate covenant keeper. The Lord is good to all was a radical theological statement in the ancient world. Most neighboring cultures in Canaan, Mesopotamia, and Egypt conceived of deities as capricious, often hostile, and certainly not universally benevolent. Archaeological findings from Ugarit, 14th to 12th centuries BCE, and other contemporary cultures reveal religious systems focused on appeasing divine anger rather than receiving divine love. David's vision of a God who has compassion on all he has made stood in marked contrast to the religious conceptions of Israel's neighbors. All your works praise you, Lord, your faithful people extol you. They tell of the glory of your kingdom and speak of your might, so that all people may know of your mighty acts and the glorious splendor of your kingdom. David now expands the circle of praise beyond humanity to include all creation, all your works. This reflects a Hebrew understanding of the universe as inherently responsive to its creator. Even without words, the natural world was seen as rendering praise through its very existence and operation. This concept appears elsewhere in the Psalms, notably in Psalm 19 verses 1-4, composed earlier in David's life, which declares that the heavens proclaim the glory of God. The second circle of praise comes from your faithful people, Hasidim, those who have experienced and responded to God's covenant love. Their praise is verbal and intentional, focused particularly on God's kingdom Malkut. This kingdom language would have had immediate political resonance for David's original audience in the 10th century BCE, who were experiencing Israel's transformation into a regional power. When David mentions all people may know, he's expressing a universalism that was unusual for his time. Most ancient societies viewed their deities as national or tribal gods with limited jurisdiction. David envisions a future where people of all nations recognize the universal sovereignty of Israel's God, a theme that would be developed further by later prophets like Isaiah in the 8th century BCE. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures through all generations. The Lord is trustworthy in all he promises and faithful in all he does. Here David contrasts God's kingdom with all human kingdoms, including his own. Archaeological discoveries throughout the ancient Near East reveal the ruins of once great empires that considered themselves eternal. Egypt's Old Kingdom, 2686 to 2181 BCE, the Akkadian Empire, 2334 to 2154 BCE, the Hittite Empire, 1600 to 1178 BCE. By David's time, these once dominant powers had already risen and fallen. Even David's own dynasty, which God had promised would endure, 2 Samuel 7 verse 16, would eventually face the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. Against this backdrop of political impermanence, David asserts that God's kingdom alone truly endures through all generations. The Hebrew phrasing here, Bekal Dor Vader, conveys continuous presence across historical transitions. The declaration that the Lord is trustworthy in all he promises would have resonated with David's personal experience. God had promised to make him king when he was just a shepherd boy, a promise fulfilled against overwhelming odds. Yet David had also experienced the painful consequences of his own failures, suggesting that his understanding of God's faithfulness encompassed both blessing and discipline. The Lord upholds all who fall and lifts up all who are bowed down. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the proper time. You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing. These verses shift focus from God's cosmic sovereignty to his intimate care for creation. The imagery is striking. God personally supporting those who stumble, lifting those bent under burdens, feeding all creatures, and satisfying desires. For David's original audience in 10th century BCE Israel, predominantly an agricultural society dependent on seasonal rains, this language of God providing food at the proper time would have had immediate relevance. The annual anxiety about rainfall and harvest was a central feature of life. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals agricultural terracing, irrigation systems, and grain storage facilities throughout ancient Israel, all human efforts that still ultimately depended on divine provision of rain at the proper time. The phrase, "you open your hand," uses the Hebrew word yad, hand, which throughout the Hebrew scriptures symbolizes power and action. This anthropomorphic imagery portrays God not as a distant cosmic force, but as personally and intentionally involved in meeting creation's needs. What's particularly notable here is how David interweaves themes of God's transcendent greatness with his immanent care. The same God who rules an everlasting kingdom is attentive to providing food for every creature. This balance between divine transcendence and immanence would become a hallmark of Hebrew theology, distinguishing it from both the distant deities of philosophical abstractions and the limited local gods of ancient polytheism. The Lord is righteous in all his ways and faithful in all he does. The Lord is near to all who call on him, to all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them. The Hebrew word translated as righteous here is tzaddik, which carries connotations of both justice and covenant faithfulness. In ancient Near Eastern legal context of the 10th century BCE, righteousness referred less to abstract moral perfection and more to proper fulfillment of relationship obligations. A righteous king, for instance, was one who protected the vulnerable and administered justice fairly. The Lord is near introduces another key theological concept, divine presence. Unlike many ancient conceptions of deity that located gods in remote heavenly realms or specific sacred sites, David describes a God who is accessible, near to all who call on him in truth. This emphasis on divine accessibility would find its ultimate expression in later Jewish and Christian theology about God dwelling among his people. The qualification "who call on him in truth" is significant. The Hebrew word emet, truth, implies not just factual accuracy but authenticity and reliability. David is describing not merely ritualistic prayer but genuine relationship. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him, introduces an important balance. The Hebrew concept of fear, yirah, encompasses reverence, awe, and appropriate respect rather than terror. This verse isn't suggesting that God grants every wish like a cosmic vending machine, but rather that he fulfills the desires of those who approach him with proper reverence. This would have been an important qualification in a cultural context where neighboring religions often focused on manipulating deities through ritual to obtain desires. The Lord watches over all who love him, but all the wicked he will destroy. My mouth will speak in praise of the Lord. Let every creature praise his holy name forever and ever. The psalm concludes with what scholars call a theodicy, an explanation of how God's goodness relates to the problem of evil. David affirms God's protection of all who love him, while also acknowledging divine judgment toward the wicked. To modern readers, this might seem like an abrupt shift in tone, but in the moral universe of ancient Israel, these twin aspects of divine character, love toward the faithful and judgment toward the wicked, were seen as complementary rather than contradictory. Archaeological findings from the ancient Near East reveal that the concept of deities maintaining cosmic order through both blessing and judgment was widespread throughout the region. For David's original audience, living in a society without modern police forces or comprehensive judicial systems, divine justice would have represented the ultimate guarantee that moral order would prevail. The Hebrew word shamad, translated as destroy, here carries connotations of being cut off or brought to ruin rather than necessarily implying annihilation. The psalm then returns to its opening theme, praise. David commits himself again to speaking praise, and then broadens this commitment to every creature. The psalm concludes as it began, with the phrase forever and ever, Elolam v'ed, creating a literary inclusio that emphasizes the eternal nature of praise. What's remarkable about Psalm 145 is how it continues to speak across cultures and centuries. From the courts of Jerusalem in 970 BCE to modern religious services around the world, these words have never ceased being recited, sung, and meditated upon. The psalm's staying power lies partly in its comprehensive vision. It addresses universal human needs, the need for meaning beyond our brief lives forever and ever, the need for moral coherence, righteous in all his ways, the need for care and vulnerability, upholds all who fall, and the need for justice. The wicked he will destroy. But perhaps most powerfully, Psalm 145 offers a practice, praise, that transforms the practitioner. Modern psychological research has increasingly confirmed what ancient wisdom traditions intuited. Gratitude and appreciation fundamentally alter our experience of life. A landmark study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 2003 demonstrated that regular gratitude practices significantly increase well-being and life satisfaction while reducing negative emotions. David, writing 3 millennia earlier, had discovered this transformative power of praise. Through wars and peace, betrayal and loyalty, sin and forgiveness, the practice of praise had become his anchor. Now, at the end of his life, he leaves this practice as his legacy. Consider the historical context of David's final years around 970 BCE. The united monarchy he had built was showing early signs of the fractures that would eventually split it after Solomon's reign. Neighboring powers like Egypt under the 21st dynasty and the rising Neo-Assyrian Empire presented ongoing threats. David's own family had been torn apart by ambition and betrayal. Yet in the midst of this complex political and personal landscape, David composed a psalm focused not on strategies of power but on practices of praise. Throughout the centuries that followed, the Jewish people would face unimaginable challenges: the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, the Syrian-Greek persecution under Antiochus IV Epiphanes in 167 BCE, the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, and countless expulsions and persecutions throughout the medieval and modern periods. Through it all, Psalm 145, incorporated into daily prayers as the Ashrei, provided a framework for resilience. The psalm reminds us that praise isn't just something we do when life is going well. Rather, it's a practice that helps us maintain perspective in all circumstances. When David writes, "Great is the Lord and most worthy of praise, his greatness no one can fathom," he's reminding himself and his readers that human troubles, however severe, exist within a larger context of divine greatness. Similarly, the affirmation that the Lord is near to all who call on him has provided comfort in countless situations where God seemed distant. From the deportees in Babylon to refugees throughout history, this promise of divine accessibility has sustained faith in seemingly abandoned places. The Psalm's emphasis on divine provision, "You open your hand and satisfy the desires of every living thing," has strengthened communities facing scarcity and want. During the siege of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, during famines throughout history, and in poverty-stricken regions today, these words continue to inspire both faith and generosity. Even the Psalm's declaration of judgment against the wicked has provided hope to victims of injustice throughout the centuries. From slaves in ancient Egypt to the oppressed under modern dictatorships, the belief that wickedness will not have the final word has sustained movements for justice and human dignity. In Jewish tradition, Psalm 145 gains special significance through its incorporation into the daily Shasharit, morning prayer service. The practice of reciting it 3 times daily was established by the Talmudic period, 200 to 500 CE, and continues in many Jewish communities today. Its absence of historical specificity, unlike many psalms that reference particular events in Israel's history, has allowed it to function as a universal template for praise. Christian communities have similarly treasured this psalm, incorporating it into various liturgical traditions. The emphasis on God's kingdom in verses 11 to 13 particularly resonated with early Christians, connecting with Jesus' teachings about the kingdom of God. The psalm's vision of God caring for the vulnerable and feeding all creatures complemented gospel accounts of Jesus' compassion and miraculous feeding. Islamic tradition, while not incorporating the psalm directly, reflects similar themes in its emphasis on Allah as Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, the most compassionate, the most merciful, attributes that parallel David's description of the Lord as gracious and compassionate in verse 8. What's particularly striking about Psalm 145 is how it balances communal and individual dimensions of faith. It envisions generations telling of God's works, verse 4, and all people knowing God's acts, verse 12, while also maintaining the deeply personal, "I will exalt you, my God the King," verse 1. This balance speaks to our dual nature as both social beings needing community and individuals seeking personal meaning. In our modern world, with its unprecedented pace of change and information overload, Psalm 145 offers something increasingly rare, a practice of focused attention and appreciation. In an age of distraction, where the average person checks their smartphone 96 times a day according to a 2019 study by Adoration, the deliberate practice of praise represented in this psalm stands as a counterbalance. An invitation to notice and appreciate rather than mindlessly consume. The psalm's alphabetical structure in its original Hebrew, with each verse beginning with a successive letter of the alphabet, suggests comprehensiveness, a praise that encompasses everything from A to Z. Yet there's a fascinating textual mystery here. In the traditional Masoretic text, the verse beginning with the letter Nun is missing, breaking the perfect alphabetical sequence. Jewish tradition offers various interpretations for this absence, including the suggestion that it represents the falling mentioned in verse 14. The Lord upholds all who fall. Whatever the explanation for this textual curiosity, the psalm's structure invites us to an ordered, intentional approach to praise, one that doesn't depend on spontaneous emotion but can be practiced systematically, even when feelings lag. As we conclude our exploration of this ancient poem, it's worth considering how its wisdom might apply to our lives today. What would it mean for us, like David, to commit to praise every day? Verse 2. How might regular reflection on the character of God, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love, reshape our own character over time? What perspective might we gain by viewing our lives against the backdrop of an everlasting kingdom? Verse 13. For 3,000 years, people have found in Psalm 145 not just beautiful poetry, but a practical spirituality, a way of navigating life's complexities with gratitude, hope, and perspective. In a world that often measures value by productivity and success, David reminds us of another metric, the capability for praise. Perhaps the most powerful evidence for the Psalm's wisdom is David himself. Despite his failures and struggles, or perhaps because of them, he discovered a practice that sustained him through every circumstance. At the end of his remarkable life, what he chose to leave behind wasn't primarily advice about kingship or warfare, but this testament to the power of praise. My mouth will speak in praise of the Lord. Let every creature praise his holy name forever and ever. There's a timelessness to these words that continues to resonate across the centuries. Whether recited in ancient Jerusalem, medieval synagogues, modern churches, or quietly in individual hearts, Psalm 145 invites us into a practice that transcends time and circumstance. In a world that constantly changes, praise remains, connecting us with countless others who have found, like David, that gratitude is not just a response to blessing but a pathway to perspective. The great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, reflecting on Jewish prayer in the 20th century, wrote, "Prayer is our humble answer to the inconceivable surprise of living." Perhaps this captures something of what David discovered and preserved for us in Psalm 145, that praise is the most appropriate response to the wonder of existence itself. As we go forward from this reflection, may we carry with us David's vision of a life oriented around praise, not as an occasional activity but as a daily practice, not as a denial of life's difficulties but as a framework for navigating them. And perhaps, like generations before us, we might discover in these ancient words a very present help for living wisely in our own time. Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, and remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.